Have you ever kept a family secret for decades? I won't ask what, just curious.
When I think back to that moment, I can still hear the exact tone in my mother's voice, the way she said, almost casually, that they just couldn't help me with the hospital bills, like it was some minor expense I could just shrug off. Not the kind of financial weight that could drag a person into a hole so deep they would spend years climbing back out of it. I had been sitting at the kitchen table with my laptop open, spreadsheets of charges and insurance statements laid out in front of me, numbers climbing higher every time I opened the mail. And I remember feeling embarrassed even asking for help because I knew I was already an adult, not some kid with a scraped knee running home for band-aids. But there are moments in life when you have no choice but to lean on the people who raised you. When they looked at me, my dad shaking his head slowly, my mom pressing her lips together, I actually felt a flash of guilt for even bringing it up, as if I had put them in an impossible position, and I told myself maybe they really didn't have the money. Everyone knows life is expensive, retirement isn't easy, and I told myself maybe the economy had hit them harder than they admitted. I swallowed it and told them I understood, that I'd figure it out, because what else was I supposed to do? Break down in front of them and beg like a child? That wasn't an option. So I went home that night and I sat with the bills spread out across my living room floor, and I stared at them until the words blurred and my chest ached, and I kept repeating to myself that it would be fine, that I was strong enough, that I would work harder, cut corners, scrape by. The thing about family is you want to believe the best of them even when you know deep down they are letting you down. For weeks after that conversation, I carried this strange mix of hurt and loyalty, telling myself to forgive them, because maybe they were just scared too. Maybe they didn't know how to tell me they had nothing extra to give. I clipped coupons, skipped meals, picked up shifts whenever I could, all the while telling myself this was just a tough season and that one day it would all even out. But then little cracks began to show, things that didn't line up with the story they had given me. It started with my sister, Kelly, mentioning offhand that mom and dad had helped her with something around her house, just a small project, nothing huge. I didn't think much of it at first, but then another time she brought up new furniture, and another time she said Dad had been over talking with contractors about plans. My brain wanted to protect me, so I brushed it off, convincing myself I misunderstood or that maybe she had paid for it herself. But the pattern was there, small comments adding up to a picture I didn't want to see, because if it was true, if they really did have money and just chose not to help me, then it wasn't about finances at all. It was about priorities, about favoritism, about where I ranked in their world. The worst part was how normal everything seemed on the surface. Mom still called me with updates about random things, Dad still made his dry jokes on the phone, and for a while I played along, biting my tongue every time I thought about asking if Kelly's little projects were really just small. I was trying to give them space to prove me wrong, waiting for them to acknowledge the strain I was under, maybe even surprise me with a little bit of support, anything at all that showed I wasn't invisible. But the surprise never came, only the slow drip of reality, each little detail like a drop of water hollowing out stone. There was one night when I sat awake staring at the ceiling, the bills still spread across my coffee table, my stomach in knots from worry, and I realized something had shifted inside me. It wasn't just about money anymore. It was about the feeling that when I needed them most, when I was scared and overwhelmed and vulnerable, they chose to step back. And worse, they didn't step back because they couldn't help. They stepped back because they didn't want to, because their attention and resources were already spoken for. That thought sat in me like a stone, heavy and unmovable, and I knew I would never look at them the same way again. But I didn't say anything right away. I went on with my life, worked through the bills, carried the stress like an invisible backpack that weighed more every day. I smiled when I saw them, I acted normal on the phone, because part of me wanted to be wrong, wanted to wake up one day and find out there was some logical explanation that would make this all feel less cruel. And yet, every time Kelly opened her mouth, she chipped away at that illusion a little more. I think the moment I knew something was really off was when she mentioned contractors plural, as in a team of people, as in not just fixing a leaky pipe, but something much bigger. She laughed about how chaotic her house had been with all the workers around, how Mom was constantly checking in on progress, how Dad was so excited to see it all come together. And I sat there on the phone, my mouth dry, my heart pounding, and I nodded along, pretending like I was happy for her, when inside me something cold and sharp was taking root. That was the moment I realized the truth. My parents hadn't refused to help me because they couldn't. They refused to help me because I wasn't the one they wanted to help. And once that thought settled in, I couldn't unthink it. I couldn't unhear those words from my mom about how they just couldn't afford to help with my hospital bills, not when I knew now exactly what they were affording. That's when the real anger started to build, and with it, a determination that if they thought I was just going to swallow this quietly, they had no idea who I had become. Kelly did not mean to tell me the whole story. She never does because she lives on a steady diet of half hints and casual bragging, but people who are excited make mistakes. So one minute she was complaining about dust and noise and unreliable work crews, and the next she was describing multiple permits, a rewired kitchen, ripped out bathrooms, a new roof, and the way our parents were handling the bills because the contractor preferred one payer rather than two, which she said while laughing. Like it was just a funny logistical quirk and not the part one could not unhear. I let her talk because I have learned that silence is more revealing than questions, and she filled the silence with a play-by-play of choices and upgrades and change orders, all the little luxuries that somehow did not count as luxuries when they were for her. And I sat there with my phone warming my hand and felt something open and close inside me like a door on old hinges. I hung up and did the one thing I knew would keep me grounded, which was to write down exactly what I had heard so I could not be accused of twisting it later. So I listed out the rooms, the materials she mentioned, the brand names she dropped without even realizing she was doing it, and then I scrolled back through texts from my parents to make sure I had not invented their earlier lines about tight budgets and careful spending and how they wished they could help but simply could not. And seeing those messages next to what Kelly had just said was like looking at two photographs taken on the same day that somehow belonged to different families. I did not cry, not then, because tears would have made me feel like a kid again, and I am tired of being the kid in this story. Instead, I called the hospital billing office and asked to speak with the same social worker who had been kind to me before, and I told her I was ready to try again for assistance and to renegotiate everything I could. Because if my parents had chosen their side, then I was going to choose mine, which meant treating this like a job and not a wound. She was patient and thorough, and she helped me file applications and pull together documents I had been too overwhelmed to gather, and over the next few days, while Kelly texted photos of tiles and faucets and cheerful captions about how her mother loved her taste, I worked the phones, appealed decisions, and shaved the balance down piece by piece until it no longer looked like a life sentence, but a set of payments I could actually make without destroying myself. That is when the anger settled into clarity, the kind that does not need yelling because it knows exactly what it knows. I did not confront anyone yet because I have learned that confronting people who are comfortable in their story only teaches them how to lie better, so I decided to let the facts do their own slow work. And I started by protecting my own space in ways that seem small but matter, like removing my parents as emergency contacts on anything medical because they had already told me who they were when things got hard, and adding my friend Amanda instead because she has never once looked away when I needed help. I cleaned up accounts, changed a few passwords, set boundaries that had been too soft before, and felt a little stronger each time I took back something that had always been mine. Kelly invited me over to see the progress and I said maybe, which confused her because I am the sister who shows up with a tape measure and a notepad and a snack for whoever is working, and she kept nudging and hinting because she wanted an audience for the grand tour. But I was not going to play that part without making my own move first. So I did something careful and polite that also happened to land exactly where it needed to, and I drafted a short message in the family group chat that said I wanted to share some good news. That the hospital social worker had gone to bat for me and helped reduce the bill by more than half and set up a plan that I could actually manage, and that I was grateful to her for showing me how to get real help when I needed it most. I hit send and put the phone down like it was hot. The reactions came in bursts, Kelly with a string of happy exclamation points about how wonderful that was, my father with a clipped line about being glad it worked out. My mother with a longer note about how she had always known I would figure it out because I am so independent, which was such a perfect reframing that I almost laughed out loud, because when people are called out without being named, they scramble to rebrand their absence as faith. I did not correct it. I did not argue. I just let the words sit in the same space as the photos she had posted of gleaming countertops and new cabinets, and I watched as the story began to tilt, just a little. That was my first small revenge, not a scream, not a scene, not even a lecture, just a public thank you to the person who actually stood up for me and a quiet reminder that I had found support where they had decided not to offer it, which landed like a dull thud in the middle of their celebration without me ever raising my voice. And when my mother called later to ask if I could come by on the weekend to see how beautiful everything was turning out, and to maybe bring that lasagna everyone loves because the crew would still be there and it would be nice to feed them, I told her I was booked and that I would let her know when I had time, and I heard the pause, the tiny static of surprise that told me she had felt the shift even if she could not name it. I knew I would go eventually, not to admire their choices, but because seeing it with my own eyes would make what came next impossible to dodge, and I wanted them looking straight at me when I said what I had to say. So I told her I would stop by the following week, and she sounded relieved, like the world had been put back on its tracks. And I let her have that feeling for a few days, because sometimes the best setup is letting people think everything is normal right before you change the terms. I showed up the following week because I had promised I would, and because I wanted to hear the story from their mouths rather than through the steady drip of Kelly's excited commentary, and I walked in prepared to be polite, to ask a few practical questions, to keep my voice steady, and then to say what I had come to say without raising the temperature, because I have learned that the most effective truth is the kind that is delivered without theatrics and without leaving any escape route for the person who would prefer to pretend nothing happened. Kelly did the tour she had been rehearsing in her head for weeks, complete with running commentary about upgrades and timelines, and how the crew had been a pain to schedule. And my mother hovered in that way she thinks looks helpful, but actually just directs attention back to her, and my father played the part of the benevolent foreman who knows what a joist is and what it costs to move a wall even when he learned it yesterday. I kept the pace she needed. I asked neutral questions about how long inspections were taking and whether the electrician had finally shown up when he promised. And I let them enjoy the performance because I wanted them relaxed enough to be honest when I dropped the conversation I had brought in my bag with the copies and the notes and the new documents that would make my point clear. When the tour ended exactly where I knew it would end, which was in the new kitchen with everyone waiting for the reaction that would validate all the effort and spending, I set my bag on the counter and said that the work looked solid and that I hoped it served them well. And before anyone could step into the expected loop of praise and affirmation, I said I wanted to clear up something that had been sitting with me since the day they told me they could not help with my hospital bills, because hearing about contractors and change orders and material upgrades had forced me to wonder whether it had truly been about money or whether it had been about something else entirely. My mother started to wave it off with the familiar lines about different situations and timing, and how Kelly's home was an investment that would pay off later, while my situation had sounded immediate and complicated and scary. And my father added that I am capable and resourceful, and that he had always believed I would handle it, and the two of them waited for me to be flattered by the compliment that was not a compliment at all. I told them that believing in me is not the same thing as showing up for me, and that when I asked for help I was not asking for a lifetime stipend or a blank check or a parental rescue fantasy. I was asking for a bridge that would have cost less than the backsplash behind me, and that what hurt was not simply the no but the speed with which the no arrived compared to the speed with which the yes arrived for everything around us. And I watched the words land because they knew they were accurate, even if they wanted to talk around them. My mother reached for the script she uses when she wants to close a subject, the one where she says we do what we can when we can, and that we are a family, and that none of it should be tallied like a bill, and I said I agreed that love should not be tallied like a bill, which is exactly why I had brought something to make the accounting unnecessary going forward. I took out the copies of the updated healthcare proxy, the emergency contact forms, and the written notice that I had filed with my providers, stating that my friend Amanda is the person to call if anything serious happens. Not because I am angry for sport or interested in humiliating anyone, but because when the hospital called last time, I needed an advocate who would say yes rather than explain why the timing was difficult, and that I needed my records to match the reality we all created together. My father frowned and asked if this was really necessary since everything had worked out, and I said that while I appreciated his relief, what worked out did so because a social worker fought for me in the exact way I had expected my parents to fight for me, and that the documents were not about punishment, but about putting the right people in the right roles, so there would be no confusion the next time life did not ask for permission to get complicated. Before anyone could accuse me of making a big deal out of nothing, I did one more careful thing, and I asked Kelly, who was standing with her arms folded in that way she thinks looks casual, whether she could do me a favor and introduce me to her contractor. Because I wanted to send a single clear thank you to the correct payer for the work, since it seemed like our parents were the ones handling the financial side, and I said it gently, with a small smile, as if this were simply a matter of manners rather than the exact sentence I had chosen to put the truth on the table without an argument. Kelly blinked, my mother shifted, my father cleared his throat, and then my mother said she would pass along the email address herself, which told me everything I needed to know about who was comfortable having the arrangement acknowledged in daylight. I zipped my bag, I said I was glad the project was moving along, and I added that I would not be able to join the next family dinner because I was catching up on extra hours to cover what remained of my payments, though I thanked them for offering to host. And I walked out without slamming any doors while leaving behind the copies of those documents on the counter with a brief note that said I appreciated their understanding. As I reached the street, I felt that clean click you feel when a boundary locks into place. Not because you shouted it into being, but because you signed it, you filed it, and you handed it to the people who needed to read it, and although I did not look back, I knew the quiet in that kitchen would be the loudest thing they had heard from me in years, and it was only the first part of what I had planned. After the confrontation in the kitchen, I knew there was no point in circling back for another round, because they had already shown me exactly where they stood. And pressing them again would not make them suddenly grow a conscience or admit openly what they had chosen to hide. What I realized, standing on that sidewalk after leaving the house, was that my revenge did not need to come in the form of shouting matches or ultimatums. It only needed to come in the form of absence, because absence, when it is deliberate and sustained, forces people to sit with their own choices in a way that words never will. So I started to pull back, not in one dramatic sweep that could be dismissed as a tantrum, but in small, consistent ways that no one could label as anything other than me living my own life. I stopped answering every phone call right away, I let messages sit for a day or two, and I declined invitations with vague but believable excuses, the kind of excuses that cannot be easily argued against because they sound like real life, extra work hours, fatigue, errands, small commitments that pile up. At first, they did not notice, or maybe they pretended not to notice, because the rhythm of family interactions has a certain momentum and people assume you will fall back into place. But as the weeks stretched into months, the gaps began to show. I skipped one dinner, then another, and when I finally agreed to come to a gathering, I made sure to leave early, claiming I had things to do the next morning. And I watched their faces register confusion at my early departure, even as they tried to cover it with polite nods. Kelly filled some of the space with her endless chatter about renovations and design decisions, but even she seemed to notice that my attention was not fixed on her the way it used to be, and that I did not ask the kinds of follow-up questions she thrives on. My absence was not only physical, it was also emotional, and when people who are used to having your energy on demand suddenly lose it, they start to feel the loss more acutely than they expect. Relatives on the outskirts began to ask subtle questions, the kind that travel in whispers, but still land exactly where they need to. An aunt wondered aloud why I had not been around for the last holiday dinner. A cousin asked if I was doing all right since they hardly saw me anymore, and each of these comments landed in my parents' laps without me needing to say a single thing. I kept my answers light when asked directly, saying I had been busy, saying life had gotten complicated, and I let the silence fill the spaces where an explanation might have gone. That silence became its own kind of weapon, because nothing unsettles people more than knowing something is wrong but being unable to force the other person to name it. The more I withdrew, the more my parents seemed to overcompensate, suddenly offering to drop things off at my apartment, suddenly asking if I needed anything from the store, suddenly bringing up memories from childhood as if nostalgia might patch over the wound they refused to acknowledge. I accepted small gestures when they were useful, but never let them reset the balance, because I had decided this was not about punishing them in a way they could point at and call cruel. It was about holding up a mirror they could not put down. Every choice they made to invest in Kelly's home instead of my health had been theirs, and all I was doing was letting them sit in the echo of that decision while I quietly redirected my life in a way that no longer placed them at the center. My revenge was not spectacular in the cinematic sense, but it was steady and cutting in a way they could not escape, because every family dinner without me was a reminder of the absence they had created. And every conversation with relatives who noticed the shift was a crack in the story they told themselves about being fair and loving parents. When Kelly's renovation finally wrapped up and she threw her little celebration to show off the results, I sent a polite text saying I was glad it all came together, but that I could not make it. And then I turned off my phone and went out with friends who had never once made me feel like my needs were inconvenient. That night, when I lay in bed, I realized how freeing it was to stop chasing approval that was never going to come and to instead let them chase the ghost of my presence. The irony was that my parents, who had always assumed I would be the one to hold the family together, were suddenly in the position of explaining to others why I was not around, and in trying to explain, they revealed more than they intended. I heard through the grapevine that my mother had said I had been difficult lately, and that my father had brushed it off by saying I was just focused on work, but the cracks showed even in those lines, because everyone who knew me knew I had never been the type to disappear without reason. The whispers turned into quiet sympathy, not for them but for me, and they were left to wrestle with the knowledge that the story they were spinning was not convincing anyone. Eventually, after enough dinners with my empty chair and enough side conversations they could not control, they broke the silence themselves. One evening, my phone rang and for once I picked up on the first try, and my mother's voice came through, carefully balanced between concern and irritation, as she asked why I had been so distant, why I had been avoiding them, why I was not around anymore. I let her words hang in the air for a moment before answering, because I wanted her to feel the weight of asking a question she already knew the answer to, and when I finally spoke, I kept my tone calm and even. Because the truth does not need volume to be devastating. I said that when I had needed them most, they had chosen to invest their time, energy, and money elsewhere, and that I had heard them loud and clear, and now they were hearing me in the form of silence. And then I let the quiet stretch, knowing full well that the next words I would choose would seal this chapter once and for all. When my mother finally asked the question out loud, using that careful tone that sits somewhere between concern and accusation, and always pretends it is neutral, I let the silence do its work because silence has been the only part of this entire situation that they have actually heard. And then I told her that there is nothing mysterious about my absence, and there is no hidden drama to decode, because what happened is simple and clear, that when I needed help with bills connected to my health, they said no with impressive speed, and when my sister wanted nicer rooms and newer things they said yes with equal speed, and that the distance she is hearing now is me repeating that answer in a language they cannot argue with. Because I am not angry in a way that needs rescuing or lecturing, I am simply done acting like their choices are accidents. She tried to say it was complicated. She tried to fold it into timing and logistics and 100 little explanations that all end in the same place, but I told her that complicated is when you want something to sound bigger than a decision, and that all of this is just a decision that I am finally respecting. I told her that I had learned more about loyalty from a hospital social worker than I had learned from my own family that month, and that because of that, the way I live now reflects the lesson, which means my life is built around people who show up, and that my calendar, my emergency contacts, my plans for holidays and quiet Sundays, all of it is now organized around people who have earned the right to be in the room when I need them, not around people who think proximity equals priority, and I told her that I am not punishing them, that I am simply refusing to keep negotiating my worth in a house that has already set its prices. She started to cry in that tired way that tries to make you feel like the villain for noticing patterns, and I let her have her feelings because her feelings are hers to manage, and then I did something she did not expect, which was to make the answer measurable without turning it into a fight, because even though I have no interest in accounting for affection, I do have an interest in never reliving that hospital month again. I told her that I had set up a small recurring donation to the hospital's emergency fund in my name, that it is not enormous, but it is steady, and that I posted a public thank you to the social worker who fought for me along with the link to that fund so that anyone who wants to celebrate my resilience can help someone else climb out of the hole faster than I did. And I said it calmly because I was not looking for applause from her. I was giving her a roadmap to what accountability looks like when you have the means and just choose to look away. I did not mention their renovation once because I did not need to, since everyone who knows us saw the photos and read the captions and can do the math without me writing it out. And I could feel her trying to decide whether to be offended or impressed that I had redirected the attention to a place that actually matters, which is exactly the point, because the attention was never the prize. The prize was control of my own story. Then I laid out the boundary in terms so clear there would be no room later for confusion, telling her that I am willing to rebuild something if 3 simple actions happen in the right order, that they acknowledge what happened without qualifiers, that they apologize without the word but, and that they make amends by covering an amount to the same hospital fund equal to 1 nice appliance or 1 change order they were proud to announce, and I said they do not owe me a cent because the debt is not to me anymore. It is to the part of the family we always claim to be when we tell stories to other people. She said that sounded like a test, and I told her it was not a test, it was a door, and people who want to walk back into a relationship cannot act surprised by the existence of a threshold. I kept living the plan because revenge without consistency is just a tantrum dressed up as a principle. So when Kelly called with a small crisis about a permit that had turned out to be more expensive than the contractor had first promised and asked if I could spot them a little to keep the schedule on track, I told her that I hoped it worked out and that a project of that size should probably have a contingency buffer, and I wished her well, and I got off the phone without explaining myself, and felt that warm click of a rule enforced without drama. A few days later I stopped by with a housewarming card because I am not trying to burn the neighborhood down, and inside the card I tucked a printed receipt from the hospital fund donation labeled as a gift in her honor. And I hugged her at the door in a way that says I am not your enemy, but I am also not your safety valve, and I left before anyone could hand me a plate to serve or a role to play that I did not audition for. My father called after that and tried a different route, the one where he pretends to talk about the weather and then slides into the real topic, and I listened, because I am not rude. And when he finally reached the part where he hinted that I might be making a bigger deal out of this than necessary, I told him that the size of a wound is measured by the person who feels it and not by the person who caused it, and that I am not interested in making him confess to anything. I am interested in living in peace, and that peace requires distance until trust has somewhere to stand. He went quiet, and in that quiet I could hear something like understanding trying to rise, and I let the pause hold because I have learned that the pause is where truth gets brave. So this is why I am not around anymore, not because I believe I have won some family argument that can be scored on a tally sheet, but because I finally believe myself when I say that I deserve a circle that chooses me without hesitation when it counts. And because the last move in my plan was never about cutting them off forever, it was about cutting off the idea that my value is negotiable. If they knock on the door I have described, they will find me there, and if they do not, they will still feel the shape of the space I used to fill, and either way I keep the best part, which is the quiet knowledge that I turned the story around without screaming, without begging, and without letting anyone else decide what I owed to people who had already shown me the limit of what they owed to me.